The blade was already at her throat before she finished screaming. Leora had been a Luna for exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes when the first assassin dropped through the skylight of her chamber like an uninvited opinion, silent, lethal, and absolutely certain of himself. The second came through the door. The third through the window. 3 men in black, moving with the practiced precision of wolves who had done this many times before and fully expected to do it many times after. They had not accounted for the door opening behind them. They had not accounted for him. What happened next would be described differently depending on who you asked. The palace guards who arrived afterward called it a security response. The assassins, the 2 who survived, anyway, called it the most terrifying 4 minutes of their lives and immediately requested to be imprisoned somewhere very far away. Leora, who watched all of it from the corner where she had pressed herself, one hand gripping a candlestick because it was the only weapon within reach, would later describe it simply as, "The moment I understood that my husband was not entirely human in his fury." Kalen did not speak. He did not warn them. He did not give them the dignified chance to surrender that proper rulers extended in stories. He simply moved, and the room became very small and very loud and then very, very quiet. When it was over, he turned to her. Silver eyes in the half-dark, chest heaving, one shallow cut across his left forearm that he appeared not to notice at all. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has just realized matters to him, surprised, almost angry about it, and completely unequipped to explain himself. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. She shook her head. Something shifted in his expression. Something that, if you had told anyone in Iron more about it the next morning, they would have politely suggested you get some rest, because the Frost King did not make that kind of face. He did not have that kind of face. And yet, he crossed the room, took the candlestick from her hand gently, the way you take something from someone who has been holding it so tightly their knuckles have gone white, and set it down. Then he sat beside her on the edge of the bed and said nothing. Just stayed, like a wall between her and the rest of the world. Leora, who had been managing her panic with impressive discipline, felt it crack slightly at the edges. She had been sold into a political marriage. She had expected coldness, distance, a husband who would treat her like a well-placed chess piece. She had prepared herself for every version of the story. She had not prepared for this. And that, she realized with a complicated, sinking, terrifying certainty, was going to be the problem. If you want to see if Leora survives the Alpha King's world and find out what he does when he realizes he's falling for the one person he was never supposed to care about, make sure to like and subscribe to the library for more fated tales. Chapter 1. The Efficient Wedding. 3 weeks and 2 days before the assassins, Leora stood in her uncle's study and received the news that her life was no longer hers to keep. Alpha Dorian had the grace to deliver it standing up, at least. He was 61, silver-haired, broad in the way of old alphas who had once been warriors and now carried the weight differently in the shoulders, in the eyes. He loved his niece. She knew this. Which was precisely why the guilt on his face was so thorough and so useless. "The treaty requires a blood seal," he said. "A marriage bond. Iremore will accept nothing less." Leora stood very still. Outside the window, 3 children from the pack were chasing each other through the common yard. She watched them for a moment. "And they chose me," she said. "Not a question. You are the closest noble bloodline to mine, that is." He paused, selecting his words with the care of a man defusing something. Available. Available. What a word. What a magnificently diplomatic way to say, everyone else had the good sense to already be married. "Who is it?" she asked, though some part of her already knew, because there was only one Alpha King in the territories whose name inspired the specific quality of silence that filled the room when she asked the question. Dorian said the name. Leora nodded. She said, "When?" She went back to her room. She sat on her bed and stared at the wall and conducted a very quiet, very internal crisis that lasted exactly 45 minutes because she had always been efficient about her grief, too. Then she stood up and began to pack. The escort arrived 8 days later, 30 Iremore soldiers in slate-gray cloaks, their discipline so precise it was almost theatrical. Leora watched them file through the dusk-veil gates from her window and thought, he sent 30 men. For one woman, who has no military training, and was told to come willingly. She wasn't sure if it was an honor or an insult. Knowing what she'd heard about Kalen, she suspected it was simply protocol, which in some ways was worse than either. His letter had arrived the day before. She'd read it twice, front to back, and then once more in case she'd missed something, a single human phrase, a word of welcome, any evidence that there was a person on the other side of the parchment rather than a policy document. There was not. The letter informed her of the travel schedule, the wedding date, the legal terms of the bonding agreement, and the specific chamber she would be assigned upon arrival. It was signed, Kalen, Alpha King of Ironmore. No flourish. No warmth. Not even a period that felt personal. She handed it back to the messenger. Please tell His Majesty I look forward to our meeting, she said pleasantly. Inside, she thought, at least the man is consistent. I know exactly what I'm walking into. Which was more than most brides could say, and she decided to count it as a point in his favor, because she intended to find as many of those as possible. Survival required optimism, and Leora had always been quietly, stubbornly good at surviving. The 4-day journey was uneventful, unless you counted the moment on day 2 when one of the younger Ironmore soldiers, clearly not briefed on protocol for escorting political brides, offered her a piece of dried fruit with the nervous energy of someone feeding a wild animal they'd been assigned to protect. She accepted it with a thank you that made him go visibly pink under his color. She filed him away as potentially human, which was more than she could say for the rest of the retinue. Ironmore appeared gradually, the way a threat does, first as a feeling, then as a shadow on the horizon, then as stone walls and dark pine forests and a sky that seemed lower here, heavier, as if the kingdom itself was pressing down on everything beneath it. The palace sat at the center like a declaration. Not a home. A statement. Leora stepped from the carriage, tilted her head back, and looked up at the iron gates, the frost-gray towers, the flags snapping in a wind that had opinions. It looks exactly like his letter, she thought. She smoothed her cloak, lifted her chin, and walked in. The wedding was 20 minutes long. 20 minutes. She would later learn that Kalen had specifically requested the shortest legally binding ceremony available. His head official, Elder Marin, a compact, sharp-eyed woman of about 60 who had clearly survived 3 decades in Kalen's court through a combination of competence and the ability to be invisible when necessary, had presented him with 3 ceremony options. He had chosen the shortest one without reading the other 2. Leora discovered this from a lady's maid who told her on the morning of the wedding with the tone of someone sharing important intelligence. The maid, whose name was Petra and who had the energy of someone who had been waiting for someone new to talk to for approximately 5 years, also informed Leora that the king had not attended his own welcoming feast the previous season, that he took his meals alone at his desk most evenings, and that the last person who had tried to make friendly conversation with him during a council meeting had submitted a formal request to be transferred to the border garrison rather than repeat the experience. He sounds delightful, Leora said. Petra blinked. That was sarcasm, Leora said. Oh, said Petra. Then, I like you. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall, which was, at minimum, genuinely impressive. Stone arches, iron chandeliers, hundreds of candles, and an entire pack assembled in formal dress, watching with the collective expression of people who were not sure what to expect, but were certain this was historically significant. Leora walked the aisle in cream and silver, wildflowers braided into her dark hair because she had insisted on it and nobody had thought to say no, which meant either it was acceptable or everyone was too intimidated by their own king to object to anything the bride wanted. She saw Kalen before she reached him. He was already watching her. This surprised her. She had expected him to be looking somewhere else, at the door, at Elder Marin, at a spot on the middle distance where cold, efficient men often directed their gaze when they were enduring something obligatory. Instead, he was watching her walk toward him with an expression she couldn't read, which unsettled her, because Leora was very good at reading expressions. He was exactly as described and simultaneously nothing like she'd imagined. The height was accurate. The jaw was accurate. The silver eyes, accurate and honestly unfair, because nobody who is also that cold should be allowed to also be that striking. It was an abuse of aesthetic. But what she hadn't anticipated was the stillness of him. He didn't fidget, didn't shift, didn't blink too often. He simply stood and watched her approach as if he had decided, some time ago, to be entirely composed for the rest of his life, and was committed to the bit. She stopped beside him. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. "Luna," he said. A greeting or an acknowledgement? Hard to tell. "Your Majesty," she replied, in a tone that was perfectly respectful and gave absolutely nothing away. Something, very briefly, flickered in his eyes. Like he hadn't expected the evenness of her. Like he'd been anticipating nerves, or deference, or the quiet trembling that most people brought into his presence, and she'd brought something else entirely. She filed that flicker away carefully. The ceremony proceeded. They spoke the words. He placed the bonding mark on her wrist, a formal press of his thumb where the wolf mark would bloom, and his hands were warm, which was the first thing about him that surprised her, and careful, which was the second. The pack cheered with the genuine enthusiasm of wolves who were relieved that the war was, theoretically, over. Elder Marin looked satisfied. Alpha Dorian's representative looked like he was trying not to cry. The feast afterward was lavish, politically mandatory, and conducted almost entirely without the king, who appeared, sat at the head table for 40 minutes, ate with the focused efficiency of someone completing a task, and then excused himself for what Elder Marin quietly described as urgent correspondence and what Leora privately suspected was simply preferring to be elsewhere. She sat at the long table surrounded by nobles who weren't sure how to talk to her, ate excellent food, had 3 conversations that were almost interesting, and watched the empty chair at the head of the table. Absent from his own wedding feast, she thought. Truly an icon. She was escorted to her chambers by Petra and 2 guards as the feast was still running. Her room was large, well-appointed, and positioned at the end of the east wing, which she would later discover was the same wing as the king's chambers, though 2 corridors apart, which she suspected was either protocol or a compromise between propriety and his evident need for distance. She changed out of her wedding gown, put on something practical, sat by the window and watched the moon, which was full and generous over Ire Moor, indifferent to political marriages. She had been thinking, almost peacefully, about what the next weeks might look like: careful dinners, careful conversations, the slow work of being present in a space where someone didn't want you there, when the skylight shattered. Chapter 2. What the Frost King does when something is his. 3 things happened very fast. The first assassin landed in a crouch between her and the door. The second came through the door itself, which meant they had neutralized both guards in the hallway silently, efficiently, before she'd heard a single sound. The third dropped from the window ledge like a shadow that had decided to become a person. Leora's brain, which was an extremely practical instrument, processed this in approximately 1 second and delivered the following assessment: armed, coordinated, professional, and not here to negotiate. She grabbed the candlestick. She was not, to be clear, under any illusion that a candlestick would substantially alter the outcome of a 3-to-1 engagement with trained killers. But there is something in the blood of wolves, even quiet Omega wolves who prefer books to battles, that refuses to stand still and wait. She gripped it like a club and put her back to the wall and watched them spread across the room, and she thought, if I scream, they'll kill me before anyone comes. If I don't scream, they'll kill me silently. These are not good options. She screamed. And then the door, not the one they'd come through, the other door, the connecting door at the far end of the chamber that she hadn't even registered as a door, opened. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not something Leora could reconstruct cleanly afterward. Partly because she was in a corner with a candlestick. Partly because the room was dim. Partly because some things happen at a speed and with a totality that the mind refuses to process in real time, filing it instead under deal with this later and simply surviving the moment. What she understood was, Kaelin moved the way a storm moves. Not with the choreography of a soldier, not with the performance of a warrior demonstrating technique, but with the absolute, economical violence of something that has decided the situation is over and is simply making the physical world catch up to that decision. He did not speak. He did not announce himself or offer terms. He was simply suddenly present, and then the room was different, and two men were on the floor and one was pressed against the wall with Kalen's forearm at his throat and silver eyes approximately 2 inches from his face. The assassin said something. Kalen said something back, very quietly. The assassin told him everything. Quickly. Leora watched this and thought, distantly, he does not need to shout. Of course he doesn't. He's the kind of quiet that is louder than shouting. The palace guards arrived 4 minutes after she'd screamed 4 whole minutes, which she noted with the part of her brain that was already calculating the security gaps she intended to mention to someone, and took the surviving men into custody. The third assassin was not surviving. She did not look at him directly. Kalen turned. There was a cut on his left forearm, shallow, still bleeding in the way cuts do when they haven't yet decided how serious they want to be. He did not appear to notice it. His eyes found her across the room, and the thing that passed through his expression was not the detached assessment of a king verifying that his political asset was undamaged. She knew what that would look like. She had been looked at that way her entire life, assessed and categorized and checked off. This was something different. This was the look of a man who had entered a room at a run before he was fully conscious of why he was running, and was only now, with the threat neutralized and her standing against the wall with white knuckles around a candlestick, catching up to the answer. Are you hurt? He said. The voice was rough, stripped of its usual precision. No, she said. He crossed the room. He took the candlestick from her carefully, his fingers curling over hers to loosen them from the grip she'd been maintaining with the dedication of someone who had decided this was her only job, and set it down. Then he sat on the edge of the bed. Just sat. As if standing required a decision he wasn't making right now. After a moment, she sat beside him. They were quiet. Outside, the palace had erupted into controlled chaos, voices in hallways, boots on stone, the organized urgency of a security apparatus realizing it had failed. Inside the chamber, there were 2 people sitting on a bed in the dark, one of whom was still bleeding and hadn't mentioned it. You should have someone look at your arm, Leora said. He glanced down at it as if noticing it for the first time. It's minor, he said. It's bleeding. A pause. Yes. Those 2 things are not mutually exclusive, she said, and she wasn't sure what made her say it, exhaustion, probably, or the particular recklessness that comes after surviving something, but it came out with the dry edge of her usual internal voice, the one she normally kept to herself. He looked at her. A long, considering look. No, he said slowly. They are not. There was another silence, and in it she felt the shape of the evening rearranging itself into something she hadn't planned for. She had planned for distance. For correctness. For the long, careful work of being a Luna to a king who had never wanted one. She had not planned for him to stay. But he stayed. He sat on the edge of the bed with her until the palace guard captain arrived to give his report, and even then he did not move for a long moment. He listened to the captain with the focused, still attention she was learning was his default mode, asked 4 precise questions, issued 5 instructions, and dismissed the man. Then he turned back to her. The attack was commissioned, he said. It was not a comfort. It was information, delivered because he had apparently decided she was entitled to it. I know the direction it came from. It will be addressed. She nodded. Who? Another look, slightly different this time. Recalibrating. You want the details, he said. Not a question. I think, she said carefully, that if someone wants me dead badly enough to send 3 men on my wedding night, I would like to understand why. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face, not warming exactly, but shifting. Like a glacier making a very slight internal adjustment that would only become visible several seasons later. There are lords in my own territory, he said, who believe this peace is a mistake. Who are profiting from the war. Who find a Duskvale Luna politically inconvenient. So they tried to kill me to restart the conflict, she said. Or to destabilize my reign. Both outcomes serve them. Leora was quiet. Then, That is enormously flattering in a very terrible way. I've never been strategically significant before. He stared at her. That was darkly humorous, she clarified. I cope with frightening things by saying something mildly absurd. I apologize. I can stop. Don't, he said. She blinked. Stop, he added, after a beat, and she realized he'd meant, don't stop. He turned away before she could examine his expression, but she filed the moment carefully, precisely, the way she filed everything. He left an hour later. At the door, he paused. I'll have the guard rotation changed, he said. And the connecting door will remain unlocked. Then he was gone, and she was alone in the chamber, and she sat for a long time looking at the unlocked door and understanding that something had begun that neither of them had agreed to and neither of them knew how to stop. Chapter 3. The Education of a Frost King. The following weeks were a study in careful distances. Kaylin knew how to be alone in a room with someone. He had spent 10 years perfecting it, the art of being physically present while maintaining the emotional equivalent of a border wall, complete with armed guards and a very clear sign that said, no entry, this means you. He conducted meetings. He attended council. He passed Leora in hallways with a precise nod and continued walking. The problem was she kept doing things. Not aggressive things. Not demanding things. Simply things. Small, observable, inconvenient things that his brain catalogued against his wishes. She sat in on a council meeting 5 days after the wedding, not uninvited, exactly, but also not explicitly invited, which meant she had simply appeared in the chair to his left with a leather notebook and a politely attentive expression, and somehow it had seemed less disruptive to proceed than to address it. She said nothing for the first hour. Asked 2 questions in the second hour, both of which were precise enough that Elder Marin had looked at her sharply over her spectacles, and then at Kaylin, with an expression he absolutely refused to interpret. He found her in the library 3 days after that. She had apparently located it on her own, a not insignificant feat, given that his palace was the architectural equivalent of a labyrinth designed by someone with trust issues, and was sitting cross-legged in the window seat with a volume of Ironmore's territorial history open in her lap. She was making notes in the margin in very small handwriting. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked up. Your history of the Eastern River Valley dispute is written entirely from one perspective, she said, which was not a greeting, but was very much the kind of thing she apparently said instead. It is Ironmore's historical record, he said. Yes, she said pleasantly. That's my point. She looked back at her book. I'm not arguing ownership. I just think you'd understand the conflict better if you knew why the Dusk Vale considered it theirs. You can't predict an enemy you've never actually read. He came into the library. He was not sure why. He sat in the chair adjacent to her window seat, which was close enough to continue the conversation and far enough to be defensible. What does Duskvale's account say? He asked. She told him. Concisely, accurately, with the occasional dryly delivered observation that functioned as commentary without derailing the information. He listened. He had not, in 10 years of fighting the Dusk Vale, ever heard their account of the original boundary dispute delivered by someone who actually found it historically interesting rather than politically motivated. It was not pleasant information. It was useful information. He was not sure which bothered him more, that he hadn't had it, or that she was the one who'd given it to him. They talked for 2 hours. He was not aware of this until he noticed the light had changed. He returned to his work. He did not think about it. He returned to the library the next evening. She was already there. She had, apparently, established it as a preferred location. She looked up when he came in, said nothing, and continued reading. He took the chair. He opened the report he'd brought with him. They sat in companionable silence for 40 minutes, which was either the most efficient use of shared space he'd experienced or something else entirely, and he was not going to investigate which. The pack noticed things. Packs always notice things. This is simultaneously their greatest strength and their most exhausting quality. Within 2 weeks of the wedding, Kaylin was aware, because Elder Marin told him with the directness of a woman who had survived his court through brutal honesty, that the pack was talking. Not maliciously. with the invested enthusiasm of people who had not had anything hopeful to discuss in a long time. "They think you like her," Elder Marin said. "She is my Luna," he said. "The designation requires a minimum of..." Kaelin. Elder Marin had called him by name perhaps 6 times in 3 decades, and each time it meant, "Stop performing for me, I was there when you were 19, and you haven't improved as much as you think." "They think you like her." "I think they may be right. I further think that this frightens you considerably, and that you are managing it in your customary fashion, which is to do absolutely nothing about it while being completely obvious to everyone in the room." He looked at her. She looked back, armored in 63 years of not blinking first. "She is perceptive," he said, finally, which was as much of an admission as he had in him. "She is," Marin agreed. "She is also, if you're interested in my observation, and I'll give it regardless, the first person in this palace in a very long time who speaks to you as though you are a person rather than a weather system. I notice you haven't shut it down." He had not. This was true. He had not shut it down, and he had not shut her out, and he had sat in the library for 2 hours last night reading territorial reports while she read history 3 feet away from him. And when she'd made a small sound of surprise at something in her book and held it out to show him without a word, he had looked. He had read the passage. He had said, And she had smiled, not at him exactly at the book, but it had been aimed in his general direction, and gone back to reading. He had not been able to reconcentrate for approximately 11 minutes. This was unprecedented. He said nothing of this to Marin. He thanked her for her report with the tone of someone who was not going to process any of it until much later, and returned to his desk, where he read the same paragraph of a border agreement 4 times without retaining any of it. This was the state of things. Outside, meanwhile, Leora was being the most destabilizing force in Iron Moor since the last volcanic winter, entirely by accident and through the radical mechanism of simply being a thoughtful, present, functional human being in a palace that had apparently forgotten what that looked like. She learned the names of the kitchen staff. All of them. This alone caused a kind of quiet revolution among the household wolves who had not been addressed as individuals by anyone in the royal wing since Kaelin's mother had died. She attended pack hearings, the public sessions where the king heard disputes, and sat quietly in the observation gallery with her notebook. She asked Petra questions about Ironmore traditions and listened to the answers with the attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, not to perform understanding. She was, in other words, doing the actual job of a Luna. Nobody had asked her to. Nobody had briefed her on it. She had apparently simply looked at the territory she'd been placed in and thought, "There is work to be done here," and started doing it. Kaelin became aware of this in pieces from reports, from comments, from the way the kitchen head, Byrne, who had been professionally sullen for the 6 years Kaelin had known him, now greeted the king's corridor visits with something approaching a smile, and had twice sent up a tray of food that nobody had ordered, but that had arrived warm and precisely timed to when Kaelin had not eaten. He confronted this evidence the only way he knew how, by finding her. She was in the courtyard garden, which had been, until approximately 10 days ago, an extremely well-maintained and completely unvisited space, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up, examining a plant with the seriousness of a physician conducting a consultation. "You're learning the territory," he said. She looked up. A smear of dark earth on her cheekbone that she hadn't noticed. "I'm learning the people," she said. "The territory is just context." He stood there for a moment. She went back to her plant. "Why?" he said. She looked up again, patient. "Because I live here," she said. "And the people who live here have been inside a war for 11 years. And someone should pay attention to them." A small pause. "Also, your cook hasn't had anyone ask him about his family in years, and he makes extraordinary food when he's happy, so there's a practical element." The corner of Kaelin's mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was a structural precursor to a smile, the geological foundation layer. But it moved. She noticed. He saw her notice. She looked immediately back at her plant. Neither of them mentioned it. He went back inside. He sat at his desk. He thought, with great reluctance and the specific discomfort of a man realizing his own architecture has a crack in it, that he was in considerable trouble. Chapter 4. The plot the Ice King never saw coming. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was a perfectly ordinary day for something that would unravel everything. It came through Kalen's intelligence network, a system he'd spent a decade building, anonymous couriers and embedded contacts, and a communication structure that was the closest thing he had to a relationship with the outside world. The letter was unsigned, but carried a cipher he recognized. It came from inside his own council. It told him about the assassins. Their employer. The name. Lord Aldrich Vane. Kalen had known Aldrich Vane for 15 years. Vane was one of his oldest council members, a man who had served his father, who had stood at his coronation, who had expressed, loudly, repeatedly, in the manner of a man who wanted credit for his loyalty, his commitment to the Ironmore throne. Vane had also, quietly, built a trade empire on wartime supply contracts. The peace treaty threatened 17 of his 32 active business arrangements. This was not what undid Kalen. What undid Kalen was the second half of the letter. The assassination attempt on the wedding night had not been the only one planned. It had been the first. A test to see whether the security around the new Luna could be breached. The next attempt, the letter said, was already in motion. Closer. More patient. Something that would look like an illness. Something that would look natural. Kalen read the letter twice. Set it down. Picked it up. Read it again. He had been running threat assessments for 15 years. He was very good at them. He could read a strategic landscape with the detachment of a cartographer, identify the vectors, weigh the probabilities, develop responses. He was not supposed to read a threat assessment and feel something before he processed it. Feelings slowed the analysis. Feelings were data that corrupted the dataset. He felt something. It arrived without announcement and sat in the center of his chest like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent out reorganized every quiet thing he'd been refusing to look at for the past 3 weeks. He was in the library before he'd consciously decided to go there. She was in the window seat. She looked up when he came in, read his face in the way she read everything quickly, thoroughly, without making it obvious, and set her book down. "What happened?" she said. He crossed the room and sat not in the adjacent chair this time, but at the end of the window seat, close enough that she would have had to work to create distance. He put the letter on the seat between them. She read it. He watched her face as she did. Watched the composure hold, the careful steadiness of her expression, the minute tightening around her eyes that was the only thing that escaped. She read it twice, then set it down between them with the same deliberate calm. "So the poison is already in the palace," she said. "Likely. Someone on staff or in the food? One or both. My team is investigating." She nodded. "Processing." He watched her do it, the quick, private work of a mind reorganizing around new information, finding the load-bearing structures and shoring them up. She was frightened. He could see it, underneath the composure. He recognized the shape of it because he had felt it once, years ago, and had subsequently sealed the room. "How long have you known it was Vane?" she asked. He looked at her. "You've been watching the council," she said simply. "I've noticed you watching Vane specifically. The way you watch something you already suspect." She paused. "I didn't want to ask before you were ready to say." There was a long silence. The library was dim, evening coming on, and outside a wind was moving through the Ironmore pines with the sound of something enormous breathing. "You notice a great deal," he said. "I always have," she said. "People just never expected it, so they never looked." He was quiet. "Then, I suspected him. I needed confirmation. And now you have it." "Yes." "What happens to him?" "He is removed from council. Arrested. Tried." A pause. "He will not be treated gently." She nodded. Then, after a moment, "And the second attempt?" "We will handle it." "We," she repeated. A small word. She was looking at him directly. He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "We." Something shifted between them in the silence, not dramatically, not with music or revelation, but with the quiet and irreversible quality of a lock turning. They had been two people in careful parallel for 3 weeks. This was the moment they became something else, unnamed and unhurried and probably inconvenient, but present. Fully, undeniably present. "I want to be useful," she said. in whatever comes next. I don't want to be the thing you protect while the real work happens elsewhere. You already are useful, he said. It came out without the usual caution, without the diplomatic distance. You have been, since the first week. The pack trusts you. The staff trusts you. You have built more goodwill in 3 weeks than most Lunas build in 3 years. He stopped himself, aware he was saying more than he had planned. She was watching him with those amber eyes, the ones that had been paying attention to everything since long before he'd noticed. You've been watching me too, she said softly. He did not deny it. Denial would have required an alternative explanation, and he didn't have one he was willing to deliver with a straight face. Kalen, she said his name, which she had not used before, which landed differently than he was prepared for. I didn't come here expecting anything from you. I want you to know that. I came because it was the right thing for my people. I have been trying to do the right thing for yours. That is all I was trying to do. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I know. And then, because the evening was dark and the letter was still between them, and he had spent 10 years building walls and exactly 3 weeks discovering that walls were significantly less effective against someone who wasn't trying to breach them at all, just quietly living on the same side, I have been trying to find reasons why this is unwise. Have you found them? She asked. Many, he said. And? They are, he said, very slowly, becoming less convincing. She looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up his hand carefully, the way he had taken the candlestick from her on the first night, like something that needed gentling, and held it. His hand, which was large and scarred and had spent a decade being useful rather than comforting, was perfectly still. He did not pull away. Outside, the Iremore pines went on breathing, and the moon, that same full, indifferent moon, rose over the kingdom, and in the library 2 people sat in the dark and held on, and neither of them mentioned love, because neither of them needed to. Because some things arrive long before their names do. 3 days later, Lord Aldrich Vane was arrested in his chambers by 6 of Kalen's guard, the evidence against him so thorough and so precise that his legal team took one look at it and advised him to say nothing at all. The second assassination attempt was intercepted before it reached the kitchen. The contact, a paid agent inside the household staff, was removed and questioned. Vane would stand trial the following month. He would be found guilty on 6 counts, including attempted murder of the Luna. Kalen attended every session of the trial. Leora attended 3. On the 4th day, when the verdict was read and the room erupted, they were standing 2 feet apart in the gallery, and when she exhaled a long, quiet breath of relief, he put his hand at the small of her back without thinking. He left it there. She did not move away. The pack, who had been watching with the attentive enthusiasm of people who had waited a very long time for exactly this, managed to contain their reaction until they reached the corridor. Elder Marin did not even try. The historians of Ironmore would later debate when, precisely, the Frost King had stopped being Frost. The more dramatic among them would cite the wedding night, the assassins, the fury, the vigil by her side in the dark. The more precise would cite the library, and the particular quality of silence 2 people share when they have stopped pretending they are strangers. Leora's own account, written in her small, careful handwriting in the journal she kept throughout that first year, marked the moment simply. He said we. And I knew. Kalen's account, which was not a journal, because Kalen did not keep a journal, but was reconstructed from 3 letters to Elder Marin and one frankly extraordinary conversation with his head guard that the guard had the discretion never to repeat, marked it differently. His version was characteristically precise and characteristically late in admitting the obvious. She is not what I thought an Omega was. She is not what I thought a Luna was. She is not, frankly, what I thought a person could be walking into an unfamiliar kingdom with nothing guaranteed and choosing, every morning, to build something anyway. I have been watching her build it for weeks. I did not understand, until recently, that she was also building something in me. That this was not a side effect but perhaps the whole point. The moon goddess, if she exists, has an extraordinary sense of the inconvenient. The war between Ironmore and Duskvale did not resume. The peace held year after year, sealed not just by treaty but by the particular solidity of 2 territories learning slowly, through the patient example of a queen who believed in knowing the people, that they had been bleeding each other over a river valley when there was, in fact, more than enough land for both. Aldrich Vane spent 7 years in an iron cell. He was, by all accounts, very comfortable with the silence. The kitchen master, Byrne, eventually taught Leora how to make the honeyed rye bread that was his grandmother's recipe, which she made every winter solstice thereafter. Petra became her head lady of chamber, her most trusted advisor, and, in the honest ledger of the thing, her closest friend. And Kaelin? Kaelin learned, slowly, that warmth was not the weakness he'd been taught it was. That a soft thing could also be a steady thing. That the woman his kingdom had sent him as a political instrument had turned out to be the one person in 33 years of living who had stood in his presence and simply, unhurriedly, undemandingly, impossibly stayed. He didn't smile often, even after. But he smiled in the library sometimes. When she found something in a book that delighted her. When she handed it over without explanation and waited for him to find what she'd found. He always did. And the kingdom, which had been so long a stone and iron thing, learned from the woman who had been sent to them as a seal on a treaty what it felt like to be warm. And